The afternoon sun gleamed off the glass walls of the high-rise office building, casting long shadows across the floor of the tech company's headquarters. Nathaniel Carter sat in his spacious office with its clean lines and modern design, every piece carefully chosen to reflect the brand he had built from the ground up. Nathaniel was a man who had fought hard to get where he was. His story was one of overcoming obstacles, both personal and professional. As the youngest black CEO of a major tech firm, his rise had been scrutinized by many who doubted his ability to lead from the start. Yet here he was sitting behind his polished mahogany desk, reviewing quarterly reports with a steady hand and a focused mind. As he thought through the numbers, he could hear the hum of the office outside his door, the sound of busy employees typing on their computers, discussing strategies, and collaborating on new projects. But despite the lively environment, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. There was something in the air, something in the way the employees were walking around with hurried steps, something that made him feel the tension before the storm even broke. Today, he was scheduled to meet with Jenna Hayes, a senior manager who had been with the company for several years. Jenna was known for her intelligence and drive, but also for her sharp tongue and her knack for creating controversy. She was a woman who always had something to say, often challenging others with her abrasive style and unfiltered opinions. Nathaniel had always respected her for her work ethic, but he had never been fully comfortable around her. Something about her attitude made him uneasy. It was as if she thought she knew everything even when she didn't, and Nathaniel had learned over the years that when people started thinking they knew everything, that's when they stopped learning. It was nearly time for the meeting. Jenna would arrive any minute now. Nathaniel adjusted his suit jacket and cleared his throat as he looked over his notes, preparing himself for whatever conversation would unfold today. He had learned to stay calm in the face of conflict, to never let his emotions cloud his judgment, but he couldn't ignore the sense of unease that had settled deep within him. There was something about Jenna's arrival today that felt different. Too many times in the past, she had made subtle remarks about his leadership style, often challenging his decisions under the guise of constructive criticism. But Nathaniel knew better. He knew when someone was testing his limits, and he had a feeling Jenna was about to do just that. The door opened with a soft click, and in walked Jenna, her confident strides filling the room. She was dressed in a sharp tailored suit that accentuated her figure, and her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, giving her an air of authority and professionalism. She smiled as she entered, offering only a slight nod in Nathaniel's direction before sitting down across from him. Her presence filled the room as she casually crossed her legs and adjusted her posture. She exuded confidence without saying a word, and Nathaniel could sense immediately that this meeting was not going to be business as usual. The moment Jenna sat down, she wasted no time launching into the meeting with a flurry of words as if she had been rehearsing her points for days. She began with a quick summary of the quarterly results, which Nathaniel had already seen, but she didn't seem to care. She went on and on about the company's performance, focusing on numbers and metrics that had already been discussed in other meetings. Nathaniel listened quietly, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of his desk as she spoke, but he could feel her energy filling the room, her voice rising in intensity as if trying to assert dominance over the conversation. She clearly had an agenda, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. As she continued to rattle off numbers and projections, her tone became increasingly dismissive, as though she was speaking to someone beneath her, not realizing that Nathaniel was the one who had signed her paycheck. Her words were sharp and pointed, and her attitude was that of someone who believed they were the only one who truly understood the business. It was clear to Nathaniel that Jenna saw herself as the expert of the room and had little regard for the opinions of others, especially his. Even as he attempted to interject with suggestions or questions, she simply brushed them aside with a wave of her hand, her eyes flicking to her notes or her phone, as if she had no time to listen to anyone else. As she continued on, Nathaniel felt a growing sense of frustration. He had seen this before, the arrogance of someone who believed their success was built on their own efforts alone, with no regard for the contributions of others or the collaborative nature of leadership. He was used to people like Jenna who thought they were indispensable. But today he could feel something deeper in her behavior, a lack of respect for him, not just as a CEO, but as a person. This wasn't just about business, this was about power and ego. It wasn't long before she began to veer off topic, speaking about things unrelated to the business at hand, her words dripping with sarcasm as she made comments about how the company might benefit from more traditional leadership. She leaned forward slightly, her voice laced with condescension as she implied that Nathaniel's approach wasn't quite what the company needed, as though he wasn't up to the challenge. Her eyes met his briefly, and there was a glimmer of something in her gaze that Nathaniel couldn't quite place. It wasn't just disdain, it was something more insidious, something that seemed to suggest she believed his position had more to do with his race than his ability to lead. And in that moment, Nathaniel's pulse quickened. Though his face remained impassive, he knew where this was headed. Jenna was trying to test him to see if he would react to her veiled jabs, or he would simply sit back and let her take control of the conversation. But Nathaniel wasn't going to let that happen. He had worked too hard to get to this point to allow anyone to undermine him, especially not someone like Jenna, whose success was built on her ability to play the game of office politics with ruthless precision. He sat back in his chair and folded his arms, his eyes locked on hers as he waited for her to finish speaking. He knew it was time to address the growing tension between them head-on. Jenna continued her tirade, oblivious to the shift in Nathaniel's demeanor, her voice growing louder as she dug deeper into her critique of the company's leadership style. She spoke about how a more relatable approach might resonate better with employees, implying that the staff would never truly buy into Nathaniel's vision of innovation and growth. She made no attempt to hide her disdain for his leadership decisions, and the more she spoke, the clearer it became that her words were meant to undermine him. She mentioned how some employees had privately expressed doubts about his methods, and how perhaps his unconventional background was affecting their ability to trust him completely. Jenna's tone was biting now, her smile almost mocking. She didn't seem to notice how Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable, or how his eyes never left hers as she spoke. The tension between them was thick now, and every word she said seemed to fuel the fire that was quietly building in Nathaniel's chest. But he remained, still choosing not to react immediately as she continued her insinuations. He could almost feel the weight of the room pressing down on him with every passing second. His mind raced, trying to figure out how best to handle the situation. This wasn't just about business. This was personal. Jenna was attacking his very worth as a leader, his intelligence, and his capabilities. And though he had faced similar situations before, this time was different. This time, she had gone too far. Nathaniel knew he could not simply let her words pass without addressing them, not when she was questioning his right to lead, or worse, dismissing his authority entirely. Jenna paused for a moment, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. She seemed to realize that her words had hit a nerve, and she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms across her chest with a smug expression, as if she had won the battle of words. But Nathaniel could see the cracks in her confidence. She had pushed too far, and she knew it, but her arrogance wouldn't let her back down. Instead, she waited for him to say something, expecting a defensive response. But Nathaniel said nothing at first. He took a slow breath and then leaned forward slightly, his voice even and calm. "Jenna, I don't believe you fully understand what you're saying." His words were soft, but his presence in the room suddenly felt much more commanding as he looked directly into her eyes. There was no anger in his tone, no sign of frustration, only the weight of authority and the unwavering calm of someone who had been in control his entire career. Jenna shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. She wasn't used to being confronted like this. Most people simply avoided conflict with her or tried to placate her. But Nathaniel was different. She had underestimated him, but now she was beginning to see the man behind the title, and he was not someone she could manipulate as she had done with others. Before he continued in the same calm voice, "Your words are not only disrespectful, they're also wrong." He paused, letting the weight of his statement hang in the air. Jenna opened her mouth, as if to protest, but Nathaniel raised a hand to stop her. "I won't allow anyone to undermine this company or its leadership based on unfounded assumptions or biases, especially not in my office." His words were like a warning, but his voice remained steady and unwavering. It was clear that the tide was turning in this conversation, and Jenna was beginning to realize that she was no longer in control of the room. Jenna opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat as she realized Nathaniel wasn't backing down. She could see the calm confidence in his eyes, and it unsettled her. She had expected him to flinch or stammer, or perhaps apologize for being too sensitive, but instead she was met with a composed authority that made her feel small in her seat. Her mind raced, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation, but for the first time she found herself at a loss for words. The silence stretched on as Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't need to say anything more to make his point clear. The weight of the moment was heavy, and Jenna could feel it pressing on her chest. She was no longer in charge of this conversation, and it was a feeling she couldn't stand. She shifted in her seat, feeling a growing discomfort creeping over her. But her pride wouldn't let her back down. She tried to regain some semblance of control by forcing a smile onto her face, but it came off as more of a grimace as she spoke with a casualness that didn't match the tension in the room. "Oh, come on, Nathaniel, it's not like I'm attacking you personally. I'm just pointing out how some people might not connect with your leadership style. I'm only trying to help." She said the words too quickly, and with too much of a forced laugh, hoping it would diffuse the tension. But Nathaniel wasn't fooled by her attempt to brush things off. His gaze hardened just slightly, his voice still as steady as ever. "Don't try to twist this into something it's not," he said slowly. This isn't about leadership styles or helping the company. This is about you using your position to belittle me and undermine my work. His words cut through her defenses like a knife, and for a moment she was silent, unsure of how to respond. She had pushed too far, and now she was trapped in the corner of her own making. Jenna tried to recover, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. I didn't mean it that way, she said, but even to her own ears it sounded unconvincing. She had meant every word she had said, and now the reality of the situation was setting in. She had crossed a line she could no longer uncross. Nathaniel's voice was calm, but there was a hint of finality in it. You may not have intended it that way, but the damage has been done, he said. This isn't just a matter of words anymore, Jenna. It's about respect and accountability. And you've shown neither today. His words hung in the air like a weight. She couldn't lift her shoulders, slumped slightly, her confidence crumbling with every passing second. The harsh truth of her own behavior was becoming undeniable. And in that moment, she realized she had made a grave mistake. Nathaniel stood up from his desk, the movement purposeful and deliberate as he walked over to his laptop and began typing with precision, pulling up documents and emails that cataloged her past behavior, not just in this meeting, but over the course of months. Small comments and jokes that had crossed the line of professionalism and respect. He didn't have to say anything as he turned the screen toward her, showing the evidence of her actions. Jenna's face drained of color. As she realized what he was doing, he was documenting everything, every disrespectful remark, every inappropriate comment, and the mounting proof that her actions were no longer going to be ignored. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The reality of the situation was sinking in, too fast, too heavy to deny. Nathaniel's fingers moved steadily over the keyboard as he scrolled through the files, pulling out the emails and reports one by one. Jenna's eyes widened as she saw the documents appear on the screen, each one a record of her behavior over the last few months, her jokes, her comments, her dismissals of others, all neatly documented and categorized. Her throat tightened as she felt the weight of her actions press down on her. She had always been able to talk her way out of situations, manipulate her way through conflicts, but this time there was no escaping the truth. No clever excuse or half-hearted apology could undo what she had done. Nathaniel's gaze remained fixed on the screen as he clicked through the files, showing her evidence after evidence of the comments she had made about him, her snide remarks about his leadership, her suggestions that his race somehow made him less capable of running the company. He paused for a moment and looked at her, his expression unreadable. You see, Jenna, he said slowly, his voice measured, this isn't just about you crossing a line in one meeting or making a mistake in a heated conversation. This is about a pattern of behavior, a consistent disregard for professionalism and respect. He leaned in slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. And that's something I won't tolerate. The silence between them was thick now, each word Nathaniel spoke carrying more weight than the last. Jenna felt her heart pounding in her chest as she searched for something to say, but the words escaped her. She opened her mouth, but found no defense, no justification for her actions. Everything she had said and done was right there in front of her, undeniable and damning. She had no escape from the situation she had created. Nathaniel turned away from the screen and placed his hands on the desk, his voice still calm, but carrying a cold finality. I'm going to have to escalate this, Jenna, he said. I'll be reporting this to HR and starting a formal investigation into your conduct. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. The reality of what was happening was crashing down on her. This wasn't just a private reprimand, this was a public affair that would be scrutinized by the entire company. Her reputation would be on the line, and she knew how quickly rumors spread in an environment like this. Nathaniel stood up straight and began to gather his papers, his movements deliberate as he made it clear that the meeting was over. Jenna's eyes were frantic now as she reached for her words, but all she could muster was a weak attempt to explain herself. Nathaniel, please, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean it that way. It was just a joke. I didn't think you would take it so seriously. But Nathaniel's face remained unyielding as he looked down at her. This is not a joke, Jenna, he said quietly. This is a matter of respect, and you've lost that respect from me and from this company. Jenna felt her face flush with a mix of anger and shame, but she knew deep down that this wasn't a matter of being misunderstood or having her intentions misread. She had crossed a line, and now she would pay the price for it. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor as she backed away from the desk. But Nathaniel didn't flinch. He didn't look away. His gaze stayed firm as he watched her every move. You can go now, he said, his voice even, his eyes cold. Jenna didn't respond. She simply turned and walked out of the room, her steps echoing in the hallway as she left Nathaniel alone in his office, the door closing behind her with a soft click, as the weight of what had just happened settled into the silence. Jenna stumbled out of the office, her mind racing with panic and disbelief. The harsh reality of what had just occurred weighed heavily on her chest. She had never been in this position before, used to maneuvering around consequences with ease. She had underestimated Nathaniel. She had underestimated how far he was willing to go to protect his leadership, and now she was in a situation that she couldn't talk her way out of. As she walked down the corridor, her steps, quick and purposeful, she could feel the eyes of the employees watching her, but she didn't care. She could already feel the sting of the whispers behind her back, the judgment that would follow her every move from now on. In the wake of Nathaniel's response, her reputation would never be the same. The tight knot in her stomach grew with each step she took. She had been so confident in her ability to control the situation, so sure that she could get away with making Nathaniel feel small. But now the tables had turned, and she was the one who felt exposed. She knew that the investigation would be thorough, that her every action would be scrutinized, but what terrified her most was the uncertainty of what would come next. How much damage would this cause to her career? How would her colleagues see her when the truth came out? She had a reputation for being tough and for getting things done. But now that reputation was being called into question, and she didn't know how to repair it. She rushed to her office, hoping to find a moment of peace to collect her thoughts. But as soon as she entered the door, she was greeted by her assistant, who was standing with a worried expression. "Jenna, are you okay?" I heard some raised voices coming from the boss's office. The assistant's voice was filled with concern, but it only irritated Jenna further. She didn't need anyone's pity right now. She was beyond that, but the truth was her mind was in chaos, and she couldn't hide it. "I'm fine," she snapped, her voice harsher than she intended as she walked past her assistant and sat down at her desk. She tried to focus on her work, opening her laptop, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Nathaniel and the way he had looked at her, his eyes filled with authority and certainty. There was no room for her usual manipulation, no room for excuses. And that scared her more than anything. She had been a senior manager for years, had climbed the corporate ladder with skill and determination. But now she felt like a child again, being scolded for misbehaving. Her arrogance had led her to believe she could push boundaries without consequences, but Nathaniel had proven that there were limits she couldn't cross. The realization made her stomach churn. She opened an email draft to try and salvage the situation. Maybe she could apologize to him, maybe she could find a way to repair the damage. But as her fingers hovered over the keyboard, she froze. She knew deep down that an apology wouldn't be enough. Nathaniel had seen through her facade, and that was something she couldn't erase. With a few carefully chosen words, she closed the email without sending it and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as the weight of her mistake settled around her. Her career was on the line now, and there was nothing she could do to stop the avalanche that was coming. The investigation would begin soon, and she knew that the outcome was already determined. She could feel it in her bones. There was no escaping the consequences of her actions, no way to turn back time and make things right. No amount of charm or clever words could undo the damage she had done. The hours passed slowly as Jenna sat at her desk, unable to focus on anything, her mind swirling with thoughts of the meeting with Nathaniel, the look in his eyes still fresh in her memory as the weight of the consequences began to settle deeper into her bones. She had always been able to control the narrative around her. She knew how to charm people, how to manipulate situations to her advantage. But Nathaniel had seen through all of that in a single moment, and now the realization of just how far she had overplayed her hand kept her on edge. As the minutes ticked by, she could feel the walls closing in. The whispers around the office grew louder, and her colleagues began to treat her differently, some with quiet sympathy and others with cold indifference. They had all witnessed her power and confidence, but now there was an unspoken distance between her. And then they knew what had happened behind closed doors, and they knew the storm was coming. Jenna couldn't escape the sense of isolation that had suddenly surrounded her. She had been the top performer, always in control, always the one to take charge of every situation. But now she felt small and powerless. Every glance her way seemed to carry judgment, even from those who had once admired her. The phone on her desk buzzed suddenly, and she jumped as she grabbed it without thinking. The caller ID displayed the HR department's number, and her stomach dropped. She knew what this call was about, and she had no idea how to prepare herself for it. Her hands trembled slightly as she answered. "Jenna Hayes," she said, her voice betraying her unease. "Hello, Jenna, this is Lisa from HR. We like to set up a formal meeting regarding your recent conduct with CEO Nathaniel Carter." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment she couldn't speak, but she quickly composed herself, taking a deep breath. "Of course," she said through clenched teeth. When would be a good time? She had no choice but to comply. There was nothing she could do but face the music now. The phone call ended, and Jenna's mind raced, her heart pounded in her chest. As the reality of the situation sank in, she could already picture the meeting with HR. It would be a formality, but the underlying message was clear: her career was on the line, and she was about to be put under a microscope. Every action she had taken over the last few months would be examined, every conversation scrutinized, and she knew she was guilty of creating the very storm that was about to destroy her. She had spent so much time building her reputation and her career, but now it felt like it was all slipping through her fingers like sand in the wind, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She glanced at her phone again and saw a text from a colleague asking if she was okay. And though the words seemed kind, the question only made her feel more exposed. She was not okay, and the entire office knew it. But she didn't want to talk to anyone, not yet, not until she had some answers of her own. The door to her office opened suddenly, and she looked up to see her assistant standing there, her face filled with concern. "Jenna, are you sure you're all right?" the assistant asked softly. But Jenna didn't answer at first. Instead, she just stared out the window as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She felt trapped in a web she had woven herself, and there was no escape from the consequences of her own actions. No quick fix, no way to charm her way out of this one. The sound of her assistant's voice brought her back to reality, and she sighed heavily. "I'll be fine," she said, though she didn't believe it herself. And as she watched her assistant leave the office, she knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger fallout. The investigation would soon unfold, and with it the destruction of everything she had worked so hard to build. The next morning, Jenna walked into the office with a sense of dread weighing her down. Every step felt heavier than the last as she made her way to her desk. The office buzzed with its usual energy, but the air felt different. It was as if the entire atmosphere had shifted. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, even when they didn't glance in her direction. There was an unspoken tension hanging over everything. The whispers had started the moment she had walked in the door, and she could feel the eyes on her back. As she settled into her chair, her phone buzzed with a message from HR confirming the time of her meeting with them. She stared at the message for a moment before locking her phone and taking a deep breath. She knew she had no choice but to face whatever was coming. She tried to push the rising panic down into the pit of her stomach, but it wasn't working. She had built her career on power and control, but now she was completely out of control, and the worst part was she knew she had no one to blame but herself. She thought back to the previous day, to Nathaniel's calm yet unwavering response to her actions, the way he had shown her that he wouldn't be intimidated or swayed, and it made her feel foolish. She had been so confident in her own ability to manipulate people and situations, but now she was the one caught in a trap of her own making. There was no escaping the consequences of her actions, no way to undo the damage she had done. She glanced around the office, but all she saw were colleagues who were pretending not to watch her. No one would dare speak to her directly anymore, not after what had happened. And she couldn't blame them. She had isolated herself with her arrogance, and now she had to face the fallout alone. As the hours dragged on, she found herself unable to focus on anything. Every thought was consumed by the impending HR meeting. She could feel the weight of it bearing down on her. Her reputation was on the line, her career was on the line, and there was no way out, no quick fix. She couldn't charm her way out of this one, and that terrified her. She had always relied on her ability to talk her way out of situations, but this was different. This time, she had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, and now she was paying the price. She had tried to play the game of power and influence, but Nathaniel had shown her that there were some things you couldn't control, some things you couldn't manipulate, and respect was one of them. She sat up straighter in her chair. As the time for her meeting drew nearer, she couldn't afford to be weak. She couldn't afford to break down in front of anyone, no matter how much she wanted to. The door to her office opened, and her assistant peeked in, looking at her with concern. "Jenna, HR is waiting for you," the assistant said softly. But Jenna didn't acknowledge her. Instead, she stood up slowly, gathering her things and walking out of the office without a word. Her heart raced in her chest as she made her way down the hall. Every step felt like it took her closer to her doom. When she reached the HR office, she knocked once and then entered the room. The silence that greeted her felt cold and suffocating. As she sat down at the table opposite the HR representative, Lisa, she tried to maintain her composure, but the knot in her stomach only grew tighter with each passing second. The conversation that followed was clinical and cold. They went over the details of her behavior step by step, every comment, every interaction, every instance where she had crossed the line and undermined Nathaniel. It felt like each word was a weight added to her shoulders, but there was no escaping it, no way to deny what she had done. No amount of excuses could change the truth. The HR meeting dragged on for what felt like hours. Jenna sat in silence, for most of it her hands clasped tightly in her lap. As Lisa spoke, her voice formal and unyielding, the list of her actions seemed endless, and every word cut deeper into Jenna's sense of self. Her attempts to justify herself fell flat with each passing moment. Lisa didn't let her interrupt. Instead, she calmly read through each instance of Jenna's inappropriate behavior, her comments about Nathaniel's race, his leadership style, and how she had undermined him in subtle ways that had all been documented. Jenna's throat tightened as the reality of it all hit her. It wasn't just a few offhand remarks that had been misinterpreted, it was a pattern of behavior that had been building up over time, and now there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. She had underestimated the seriousness of her behavior, and now she was paying the price. Every attempt to backtrack felt futile and hollow as Lisa continued to speak. Jenna's mind raced. She knew she was in deep trouble. But what could she say now? There was no room for negotiation, no way to get out of this situation with a simple apology. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. The weight of her arrogance crushed her as Lisa finally finished going through the documentation and paused to look at Jenna for the first time. The room was heavy with silence as Jenna met her gaze. Unable to look away, Lisa's expression was unreadable, but there was no sympathy in it, just a cold professionalism that only made Jenna feel more exposed. "Jenna, we take these matters very seriously," Lisa said after a long pause. "Disrespectful behavior towards a colleague, especially the CEO, is unacceptable. And it's especially troubling when it's accompanied by comments that could be seen as discriminatory. We've conducted a thorough review, and we've concluded that your actions have violated company policy." Jenna's heart sank with every word, but she knew this was coming. She had known since the moment Nathaniel had confronted her in his office. The investigation had only been a formality, but hearing it out loud made it feel even more real. The finality of it all was suffocating. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She couldn't find the strength to argue or defend herself. All she could do was sit there in stunned silence, waiting for the inevitable. Lisa continued, "As a result, we're putting you on suspension while we evaluate the next steps. This could result in termination if it's deemed that your actions were severe enough to warrant it." Those words hit her like a slap to the face. The reality of losing everything she had worked so hard for, the career she had built from the ground up, was now hanging by a thread, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The weight of the situation was almost too much to bear, and for the first time in a long time, Jenna felt completely powerless. Lisa leaned back in her chair and looked at her with a neutral expression. "You'll receive a formal notification of the suspension and the next steps in the process by the end of the day," she said, the finality of her words making Jenna feel even smaller than she already did. Jenna nodded numbly, not trusting herself to speak, as she stood up and left the room, her legs shaky as she walked down the hall back to her office. Every step felt like she was walking through a fog. The door to her office closed behind her with a soft click, but the emptiness inside her was anything but soft. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in. She was suspended, her career was on the line, and the worst part was she had no one to blame but herself. Jenna sat at her desk in a daze, staring at the computer screen, but not seeing anything as her mind replayed the words from the HR meeting over and over again. She was on suspension pending further evaluation, and the threat of termination hung over her like a storm cloud. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of regret and frustration. She had always prided herself on her ability to control situations, to be the one in charge, but now she was a prisoner of her own actions, and there was nothing she could do to reverse it. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it absently. It was a message from her assistant asking if she needed anything, but Jenna didn't respond. She didn't want to talk to anyone, not yet, not until she had sorted through this mess in her head. She had no idea how to fix what had happened, how to regain the respect she had lost, or if she even could. She had been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder that she had forgotten about the people along the way. She had treated Nathaniel like a stepping stone instead of a colleague, and now she was paying the price for her arrogance. The knock at the door brought her out of her thoughts, and she looked up to see her assistant standing in the doorway with a concerned look. "Jenna, can we talk?" the assistant asked softly. Jenna didn't want to talk. She didn't want anyone's sympathy, but she saw the genuine concern in the young woman's eyes and sighed deeply. "Come in," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. The assistant hesitated for a moment before sitting down, but Jenna could see the unease in her posture. The tension in the air was palpable, and the silence between them stretched on for a few moments before the assistant spoke again. "I just wanted to check in on you. You've been under a lot of pressure lately, and I know things have been difficult with Nathaniel." Jenna didn't respond right away. She couldn't find the words to explain the depth of what she was feeling. The weight of her situation was too overwhelming, and all she could do was sit there silently. The assistant looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and apprehension. "Jenna, I just wanted to say that I've always respected you, and I know you've worked hard to get where you are, but sometimes people make mistakes." Jenna's heart sank at the words. She wasn't used to hearing this kind of sentiment from anyone in the office. She was the one who had always given the advice, not the one to receive it. She swallowed hard, trying to maintain some composure. I made a mistake, she said finally, her voice hollow. And now it's too late to fix it. The assistant's face softened, but she didn't push further. Instead, she stood up and placed a hand on Jenna's shoulder. Whatever happens next, I just want you to know that people care about you here, she said quietly. And with that, she left the office, leaving Jenna alone with her thoughts. The weight of the situation was too much for her to bear. And for a long while she just sat there staring at the empty desk in front of her. The words from the assistant echoed in her mind, but they felt distant, almost like they were meant for someone else, not her. She had never needed anyone's pity before, and she wasn't about to start now, but deep down she realized that the loneliness she had spent years cultivating was now closing in around her. She had isolated herself with her ambition and her arrogance, and now she was paying the price for it. She was suspended, and the future of her career was uncertain, and there was no one to blame but herself. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks, and for the first time in years, Jenna felt truly vulnerable. Jenna spent the rest of the day in a fog, unable to focus on anything that was in front of her, her mind constantly drifting back to her conversation with HR, and the reality of her situation. She sat at her desk, but didn't work. She just stared at the wall as time passed slowly, and the weight of her failure pressed down on her. She had always been so sure of herself, so confident in her abilities, but now she was lost in a sea of regret. She had let her own sense of superiority blind her to the consequences of her actions, and now she was paying the price. The phone on her desk buzzed again. This time it was a message from a former colleague who had left the company a few months ago. She hadn't spoken to her in a while, but the message was simple and direct. Heard what happened. Sorry to hear you're going through this. Let me know if you need anything. Jenna stared at the message for a moment, unsure how to respond. She had never been the type to ask for help or sympathy, and now the idea of it felt foreign and uncomfortable. She had prided herself on being independent, on being the one who people turned to for support. But now it seemed that she was the one in need of support, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. She opened the message to type a response, but stopped halfway through, realizing that there was nothing she could say that would make this situation better. The damage was already done. No words could change the course of what was happening. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a call from Nathaniel's office. Jenna hesitated for a moment before answering, her heart racing as she wondered what he wanted from her. Hello, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Jenna, this is Nathaniel. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made her stomach tighten. I wanted to let you know that the formal investigation is proceeding as planned. Jenna's chest tightened, but she remained silent. She had known this was coming, but hearing it from him made it all feel so real. I'll be reviewing everything and I'll be making a decision soon, he continued, his tone neutral, but there was an unmistakable authority behind his words. I suggest you take this time to reflect on your actions and consider how you'll move forward. The words stung more than she had expected, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she just nodded, though he couldn't see her. I understand, she said softly, and there was a long pause on the other end before he spoke again. Jenna, I don't want to lose a talented leader like you, but this isn't just about performance anymore. It's about respect and how we treat each other. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that she hadn't expected. He wasn't just talking about the company, he was talking about her as a person. And for the first time in a long while, Jenna felt the gravity of her actions sink in deeper than ever before. She had always seen herself as someone above reproach, someone who could do no wrong. But now she realized that her actions had consequences, and those consequences were far-reaching. She had failed in the most fundamental way by failing to show respect to those around her, and now she was facing the fallout of her own choices. I'll do better, she said quietly, though she wasn't sure if she truly believed it. The call ended shortly after that, and Jenna sat there for a long time staring at her phone in the silence of her office. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew that her journey at this company had reached a crossroads. Her future was uncertain, and she had no one to blame but herself for the mess she had created. The next few days passed in a blur for Jenna. She barely slept, her mind consumed with the aftermath of her actions and the weight of what was coming. She couldn't escape the dread that settled deep in her chest as she waited for Nathaniel's decision. Every part of her career felt fragile, as if the very foundation she had built was crumbling beneath her feet. She spent hours reflecting on everything that had led her to this point, the choices, the comments, the arrogance that had led to the point where her entire career could be destroyed. But she also began to realize that this moment could be the catalyst for change if she allowed it. The hardest part was facing the fact that she had failed in the most basic way. She had let her own prejudice cloud her judgment. She had been so focused on power and influence that she had forgotten about the respect that everyone deserved. She had treated Nathaniel like an obstacle to overcome instead of a peer, And now it was clear how damaging that attitude had been not just to him but to her as well. As in days past, Jenna found herself reflecting on her own behavior with a newfound clarity. She realized that she had been blind to how her actions had affected the people around her. It wasn't just Nathaniel that she had hurt, it was her colleagues, her team, and even herself. By thinking she was untouchable, by assuming that her success gave her the right to treat others however she pleased, she had destroyed the very reputation she had worked so hard to build. She started to wonder if there was a way back from all this, or if she had burned every bridge beyond repair. She knew that the decision Nathaniel was about to make would define her future, and there was nothing she could do to change that. But she could still try to change herself. It wasn't too late to show that she could learn from this, that she was capable of growth, if she chose to face the consequences of her actions with humility and self-awareness. The night before the final meeting, Jenna sat in her office long after everyone else had gone home. The silence around her was deafening. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't sure what Nathaniel's decision would be, but she knew she had to take responsibility for what she had done. If it meant losing everything she had worked for, she would accept it with grace and learn from the experience. It was the only way forward. She thought back to the conversation with Nathaniel when he had told her to reflect on her actions. His words had struck a chord with her, because she realized he wasn't just offering her a chance at redemption, he was giving her an opportunity to transform herself into someone better than she had been, someone who understood that leadership was about respect and not just power. She could only hope that it wasn't too late to prove it. When the morning came, Jenna walked into the office with a calmness she hadn't felt in days. The fear was still there, but it had been replaced by something else, a quiet resolve to face whatever would come next with honesty and a willingness to learn. As she entered the conference room, Nathaniel was already there, his presence as commanding as ever. But today it felt different. He wasn't the same person she had tried to manipulate. He wasn't the same person she had underestimated. He was the CEO, and he was in control. But today, Jenna wasn't afraid of that anymore, because she was finally ready to face the consequences of her actions and accept whatever decision he would make. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but it would be necessary for her growth. No matter what happened next, she had made her peace with it, and she was ready to move forward. As Jenna sat across from Nathaniel in the conference room, she could feel the weight of the silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was thick with anticipation. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and for the first time in a long time, Jenna felt a strange sense of calm. She had expected fear to flood her chest, but instead she felt something different, something like clarity. Nathaniel's gaze was steady, unwavering as he looked at her, and Jenna knew that this moment would define everything that came next. He finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Jenna, I've thought a lot about this, and it's clear to me that your actions have had serious consequences, not just for you, but for the team, for the company as a whole." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Jenna nodded. She knew this was coming, but she was ready to hear it. She had braced herself for the worst, but at the same time she wasn't sure if she was ready to face the full extent of her mistakes. "You've made a lot of enemies with your behavior," Nathaniel continued, "and you've damaged the trust that was placed in you as a leader. But at the same time, I can't ignore the potential I see in you. I've seen the drive, the ambition, the talent that you have, and I know that you are capable of more than what you've shown." Jenna's heart raced with both relief and uncertainty. She wasn't sure where this conversation was headed, but his words gave her a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark that perhaps she wasn't beyond redemption. "I won't lie to you," Nathaniel said, his eyes locking onto hers. "This has been a wake-up call for you and for everyone around you. You've hurt people, and that can't be erased, but I believe that you can learn from this and do better if you're willing to take responsibility and make real changes in how you approach your role here." Jenna sat there in stunned silence as Nathaniel's words washed over her. She had expected to hear that she was done, that her career was finished, but instead, he was offering her a second chance, a chance to redeem herself, a chance to rebuild what she had destroyed. "I don't expect this to be easy," he continued. "You'll have to work hard to regain trust and respect you've lost, but I'm willing to give you the opportunity to prove that you can change." It was as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She hadn't expected forgiveness. She hadn't expected leniency. But in that moment, she realized that what Nathaniel was offering her was the chance to grow into something better than she had ever been before. Jenna swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded slowly. "I understand," she said, her voice steady, "and I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make things right." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment before giving a small nod. "I'm glad to hear that," he said simply. "But remember, this isn't just about what you say, it's about what you do. Moving forward, your actions will speak louder than any words you can offer." Jenna stood up, her heart still pounding in her chest, but now with a sense of purpose. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but it was a road she was willing to walk. She had made her mistakes, but now she was ready to take responsibility for them and prove that she could be better. As she walked out of the conference room, she felt a sense of resolve that she hadn't felt in months. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never make the same mistakes again. And with that promise to herself, Jenna began the journey of rebuilding her career one step at a time.